There has never been a moment in your life when you have not been around horses, has there?
That's true. I can't remember not having horses.
And how did that first start? Tell me a little bit about your background as a child.
Well, since I can't really remember not having horses, I can't remember any of my first horses. But they were really my father's horses. My father made a living racing harness horses. So I was brought up the racetrack. The first horse I can remember ever being on its back was a big white horse that my father got, I have no idea where. But he would lead me and my sister on him. And my biggest memory is of him rearing up, losing both me and my sister, because we were just little girls holding on to the mane and we were both on the ground. My sister never got back on, and pretty much to this day hasn't ridden. But see, I was first because I was the youngest and I fell on top of her, which broke my fall. So I didn't think it was so bad to fall off a horse, so I got back on and keep getting back on for some unknown reason.
Now, at one point, didn't you have fairly early on a pony that you taught tricks to?
Well, no, it was a foal that was on our farm that was a standardbred. And I taught him how to bow. I thought that was a real neat trick. And my father was at the racetrack with the horses, and when this horse was turned out in the summer and I got to come home, I would play with him. And he was a very good friend and learned real quick how to bow. Well, he got to be a 2-year-old, needed to be broke to be a racehorse. And the blacksmith came out, decided it was time to shoe him. Every time they'd pick up his foot, he'd go down on both knees. I was in school, thank God. And I got home from school and I heard about how stupid this horse was, and they couldn't get any shoes on his front feet because he kept going down to his knees. Then the decision was, do I tell my father or do I just say, oh, I wonder why he did that? Which wasn't the choice because I was afraid the horse was going to get blamed. So I told him how I taught him to bow. And because he thought I was taking the blame for the horse, he said, well, come on, Nancy, we're going to go out to the barn. Show me what you taught this horse. So I proceeded to touch the horse right behind his elbow, and sure enough, both knees go down, his head goes down. And my father says, why would you ever teach a racehorse how to do that? And my answer was, I thought it was a good trick. And Dad just kind of shook his head and went back in the house and told Mom that the horse knows how to bow. Now we got to teach him not to bow. And that wasn't my job. I don't know who taught him that.
Oh my gosh. So you really, you grew up on a number of different tracks, right?
Right. When I was young, we switched schools 3 times a year. My father raced at Buffalo, Batavia. And then at that time, there was no winter racing. And so he bought a farm in Honey Eye Falls, which is not where we are now. It was a different location. But then when the year I was born, we had bought the property that now is the farm that I'm on. So I basically grew up on the farm we're at now.
And I don't think a lot of people know, but your prefix, Sunny Acres Farm, that's from your dad, right?
That's correct. He named that Sunny Acres Farm, and for many years there was a racehorse on the side of the big hay barn with Sunny Acres written across the top. And I don't know who did the artwork. It was a wonderful logo, but then we've painted and we've never had it on the barn again.
So that was really, and that was the banner that you raced under.
Yes, Sunny Acres Farm was our farm. My father didn't breed very much, so there weren't horses that actually were named Sunny Acres, but it was always our stable name.
And you did, he did make, this was his full-time living, and he,
oh yes,
he made a business out of the buying and the selling and the training.
He was a real wheeler dealer in the horse business, and he would go to sales, buy horses, get them going, sell them, race them, and somebody wanted to trade a horse, he'd trade for something else, and for some reason, I don't know why, he often had car dealers that had harness horses with us, and so sometimes he'd trade for cars, he'd get a couple horses, and next thing you know, we'd have a nice new Cadillac, and I don't know how it all went about, but I know there wasn't a lot of money that exchanged hands, but there were a lot of horses that came and went through our barn.
Now, did you get involved at an early age helping your dad with the horses, or were you, how did it come about that you started working horses?
Well, again, I can't really remember when I started. I can remember being very little, and the best thing on Saturdays to do was go out with the manure spreader. I'm not sure why, but it was like Saturday, and we'd hear the tractor start up, and my sister and I would get our clothes on as fast as we could to go out with the manure spreader. But part of it was we'd come back in, we'd be in the barn with the horses. We were allowed to brush off some of the horses. There were some horses we weren't allowed to brush off because standardbreds can be a little bit high-strung, as a thoroughbred is. But there were a lot of horses we could help out with. And my first time probably that I can remember driving a horse was with my father sitting in his lap as he was in the jog cart, and I was sitting in between him and the reins. And I don't know, I would probably say somewhere between 7 and 9.
Oh my gosh, so it was a really early age
Yes.
then.
Yes.
Now, I want to fast forward just for a moment, and I want to ask you, you're a trainer at this point in time. You've been with the Morgans for many, many years. What of your father, the way that he trained, or things that he worked with you on, has influenced how you are around horses? Are there any things that really...
Well, I think one thing he taught me was patience. He was a very patient man and soft-spoken man. He seemed to command a lot of respect with people, but it wasn't from yelling. It was, for some reason, if Dad said something to somebody, they'd say, oh, I'm going to try that. And I think probably I learned from him that if you're patient and you listen, what works on one horse doesn't always work on the next. And you'll figure out that horse if you give yourself and the horse time. Don't try to force him into a corner. Don't force yourself into a corner that you can't get out of without losing the battle. And the other thing that I often hear him say in the back of my mind is that you're not going to make that horse do whatever it happens to be you're trying to do. You can't make a 1,000-pound animal do what you want it to. You have to convince it wants to do it. And that's kind of probably the biggest thing he always taught me, in that you don't make them do anything. And anybody who tells you they can make a horse do that for you, they won't make him. He'll finally decide to do it.
Now, at what point did you have a horse of your own? Do you remember your...
Well, I can remember begging for a long time for a riding horse, because our horses produced. They had to make money, and that's what they were there for. And if you fed a horse, he's going to pay you that money back. So getting a riding horse for just pleasure was really something that my mother had to help me work on my father for. And as it happened, my mother we had a vet that also worked at Finger Lakes, and they had a ponying horse over there, a quarter horse, that she was working with the vet on getting, and letting Earl know a little at a time. And my father happened to be at a sale looking for a new manure spreader. And he bid on a quarter horse at the sale and ended up getting it. And that same afternoon, my mother put a down payment on this pony horse at the racetrack, Finger Lakes racetrack. So when I got home from school, Mom told me about the horse, and I was all excited. I was going to have my own horse. I was going to be a riding horse. I was so excited. Dad comes home, and Mom says, how'd you make out at the sale? And he says, well, I didn't get a manure spread, but I bought Nancy a horse. And then I didn't know who to look at, and Mom goes, oh, we need to talk. So I actually had 2 horses for about 24 hours. Luckily, the people that had the pony horse knew that they could sell that horse again at the racetrack. So I ended up with the one that my father got from an auction, which was a beautiful blue roan quarter horse that I learned a lot from.
So you went from no horses to 2 horses. And I think it's also interesting that your mother is probably one of the all-time non-horse horse supporters, right? Because she never, did she really get very involved in the
She
horses?
rode
or-
as a young girl when she was a working girl before she met my father and stuff, but she never had any intention of working around the horses. And pretty much most of her life was working with Dad, alongside of Dad, doing the grooming, getting the horses ready to race and things like that. And she also, I guess, was very avid, since I've had the horses, very avid supporter of us and the whole family. You know, I think she's missed one Syracuse show since I started showing there.
She's always in the stands.
Yeah.
Now, so here you have this roan, and you say that he really taught you a lot. And this was during the time where you used to kind of saddle up in the morning and just roam all over Honeyway Falls with that horse, right?
Well, a lot of times no saddle. And I had a friend that lived about 6 miles down the road, and we would always, as soon as school was out, we'd each go get our horse and we'd meet halfway. And you're right, we just ride wherever we could find an open field, farmers' lanes. I'm sure in this day and age we'd have probably been arrested a dozen times, but back then they didn't care. They were kids. They were riding through the field, and we knew enough to stay on the outside of the field. We didn't go across the center like the snowmobilers do, but we knew to respect their lots, and we did an awful lot of riding just out in the country.
Right. Now,
But I started with that quarter horse barrel racing. So that was my first exposure to showing, was that, my first one was at a junior rodeo, and it was barrel racing. And that horse was a pretty good barrel racer.
I think that's something about you that nobody realizes.
Probably a scary thought when you think about it now.
Isn't that something? So you did the barrel racing. Now, at a certain point in time, were you one of the first females to get a driving license, or you?
Well, they have, to get a driver's license to drive standardbreds now, you have to go through a written test, and then what they call a practical test, where you have to identify things that are set out, parts of the horse, things like that. And then they give you what they call a qualifying license, which means you can race in any non-parimutuel race, which means non-betting race. So I got that, and I thought that I was going to spend my life racing horses. And there wasn't many women racing at that time. There were very few women racing, and you see a lot more of them now. But then you had to have that for X amount of time before you could move on to your parimutuel license, which you had X amount of time before you could get your full standing license. And as things changed, I met Dale. He had his license, and somehow I got put on the back burner. And although I enjoyed driving, and fair racing was always a blast, and I still love to see fair racing, I never got my full parimutuel license.
Now, let's talk a little bit about your other half, Dale, and how you came about meeting him. That was at the track, correct?
That was at the racetrack, yep. And he happened to be stabled at the racetrack, kind of like at the horse shows. You don't know who you're going to get stabled next to or across from, and he happened to be in the barn across from us. And I said, I'm going to date that guy before the summer's over, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and you've been married for how many years now?
It'll be 35 years in May.
All right. So, and that came about again because of the meeting at the track.
Right, and probably because of horses. I don't think I ever would have married somebody that wasn't involved in the horses in one way or another.
So the two of you became involved and eventually married, and at that point in time, what were your thoughts about where we go, what we do next, what?
Well, I guess probably we just assumed we'd be racing horses. And we raced at several places. We raced in Michigan, we raced in Lexington, we raced in Pompano Beach, Florida. In fact, when we would go down there, we would take all the 2-year-olds down and break them to harness, and we'd get to go a month before the track opened. And we were working for a man at the time that sent us down there with the 2-year-olds because he thought Dale and I had the patience and the stamina to get these things broke before he got down there and had to start training them. So that was kind of our introduction to breaking horses, and we never had too much problems with them and enjoyed doing it. We really enjoyed putting the horses to the cart for the first time and everything, and I think that obviously has fallen over to we break an awful lot of Morgans for people across the country and across the state. And we enjoy that. We really like the young horses. And what really got us into the Morgans was Suzanne Steele. She, one year we were at Vernon Down, well, we were at Vernon Down several years, and one year it got to be winter time. They don't race in the winter, they do now, but they didn't then. And she said, I would like you to be managers of the farm where I keep my Morgans. And so we kind of hemmed and hawed and didn't know if we wanted to do that or not, but we ended up doing it anyways. And we lived there, and there were both standardbreds and Morgans on that farm. And we, well, while we were there, Sue got me my first Morgan from Claire Murphy. And then after we got, that one broke, she says, I've got one I want you to break to drive. And so she started getting us a few of her horses to break to drive, which usually then went on to Mike's, and he got them finished, and the rest is history with Mike. We know that.
And that would be Mike Gobig, right?
Mike Gobig, yes. And so we stayed at her farm. It wasn't her farm. It was actually a place that she kept her Morgans. It belonged to a gentleman named Mike Krakow. But then through Sue, she got me showing. You got to go to a show. Sue says, you got to take this horse. This is a nice horse. You got to take it to a show.
Now, at this point, do you own a Morgan yet?
I own two.
Okay.
I bought a filly from Claire Murphy, and then I went back about 4 months later and bought a yearling colt. So I had a yearling colt and a yearling filly.
All right.
And Sue says, you got to show the horse. You got to show the horse. I said, I don't know anything. Well, it's confirmation. It's not that hard, she says. So the first show we went to was the amateur show in Elmira. And Sue pretty much walked me through everything, and she tailed for me. She said I had to head the horse, but she tailed for me. And we went with that yearling up there. It was a horse called Vidler's Modern Air. And we went Grand Champion Stallion before we were through. Lyman Orchard was the judge. He loved the horse, and of course got the bug like everybody else does, and still doing it.
And it certainly didn't hurt that you went Grand Champion Stallion your first time out.
No, that didn't hurt at all, and I'm sure it didn't hurt to have Suzanne Steele tailing for me either.
Oh, now I want to back up a little bit to the first horse, and was that Passing Glance? Your first Morgan from Claire Murphy.
No.
All right, all right.
Vidler's Modern Air.
Okay.
Actually, my first one was Flashy Babe.
Flashy Babe, all right.
And then within 6 months I had bought Vidler's Modern Air.
Okay. Now, Flashy Babe was out of what stallion?
Flashy Babe was by their horse, Vidler Showboat, and out of a mare called Orkland Yolanda.
Yeah, yeah.
So she was, no, I'm sorry, Leader's Janie Babe. That was Orkland Yolanda daughter. So she was a flashy chestnut. Being at the racetrack, I saw a lot of bays, blacks, boring looking horses to me. I was not going to get a solid bay Morgan. So I got a flashy chestnut with a white face and 2 white socks, and probably Claire was so glad to get rid of that horse. But she turned out to be a wonderful broodmare. I've sold her horses from California to Florida, and she has been an outstanding broodmare for me. And unfortunately, I lost her 5 years ago. But everything just about my breeding program traces back to her.
Back. So she was really your foundation mare. Now,
absolutely.
It's interesting because Claire Murphy has kind of a fun reputation of being one that did not necessarily want to part with her Morgans. So
she never wanted to part with her Morgans, but I think the fact that Suzanne had taken me up there, and one thing about Claire, she always had plenty to choose from. There were always lots of Morgans, and the young ones were the least expensive because they hadn't done anything yet with them. And since I felt quite confident that Dale and I could get a horse broke, I said, well, I don't want to spend a lot of money. And at that time, we still had standardbred, so I didn't think I'd have a lot of time to donate. I was looking for a horse to just enjoy, to trail ride, to fun ride, to drive. And so it worked out well, and Claire pretty much, like I said, you know, she took me through the pastures which have mares and foals, and you didn't know who belonged to who. She did, I didn't. And I just happened to really like this chestnut filly with this gorgeous face and white blaze, and I said, that's the one I want. I think maybe Suzanne was hoping I would look for a Caden Vildon daughter.
Well,
but
I was just going to ask you about that because Suzanne owned Caden Vildon.
Correct.
And was Caden Vildon at Claire Murphy's at that point in time?
Yes, he was. He was still at Claire's, and in fact, I had the opportunity to ride him while he was at Claire's, and that was quite a thrill. And
what was he like to ride?
he had a big go motor. He liked to go forward, and I certainly didn't know much about saddle seat at the time, but he was a gentleman. He didn't do anything to try to get me off or take advantage of me, which I'm sure he could have. But he was fun to ride, and I think he sold me on Morgan's because of the fact that there was so much trot there, and he lifted you up, and it was, I'm in hunter territory where I live, and people will say, don't you jump Morgan's? I said, well, they can jump, but once you ride a good trot in Morgan, it's like jumping every step. Because when they trot, they lift you up and you're going, and I said, it's just, I don't know why anybody would want to go over 6-foot fences. I got a Morgan.
So he really kind of helped you along when you were thinking about the breed. And you talked about your mare being out of Vidler's Showboat. Was Vidler's Showboat on the premises at that point in time?
Yes. Yes, he was still fairly young at that time. And in fact, In Command was still there at the time. And In Command was a very impressive horse. I had seen him several times at Claire's. I went to Claire's when she was still up on the hill in, what was the name of that little town? Okay, that leaves me. But anyways, she was still up there, and she, that was before she had Wasika's In Command. And then when she moved to the other place and In Command was there, I was there several times to see her babies, and she became a very good friend. I loved going to Murphy's.
Right.
She always had some outstanding foals.
Yeah, she had some really powerful blood there, and she knew what she had too.
Yes. Oh
So-
yeah. She knew bloodlines, and she knew what she was looking for. And I always have a fond memory of Will getting one of his first rides when he was about 3 on In Command. They let him out of the barn. We put Willie up on his back, and Pat and Janie said, well, just have him hold on to the mane and we can lead him around. And I thought, that's really nice of them. And as time has gone on, I thought, I'm not sure I appreciated what they were doing at the time.
Right. So here you are with Vidler's Modern and your mare, and you're working for Suzanne Steele. And what comes next?
Well, next, actually, my father's death brought us back to Honey Falls, the place I grew up. And we left there with those 2 Morgans and moved home to the barn that had been pretty much empty and used for storage. There was a boat in there was some motorcycles, and so we just went in there, and Mom said to us at the time, I would rather see the family have the farm than to sell it. So you just pay off your sister what's fair, and the farm is yours. So so that's how we got the farm. And of course, at the time the back stalls had to be redone. The front stalls we could use the way they were, and we only had 2 horses, so we had 10 usable stalls and lots of work to do, which worked out fine. It was a project, and as anybody who owns a farm knows, it's an ongoing project. You're still either putting up new fences and tearing down fences, or new roofs, or new paint. So that brought us to Honey Falls and brought us to saying, I think we should have a foal. Everybody that has Morgans makes that mistake. Then 1 foal is never enough. And the next thing you know, you've got a prefix and you're breeding horses.
Right. And this was, Dale at this point in time was working for a local nursery. And
Right, he was a landscaper, and he was working at a nursery, and I was a vet tech at a local small animal hospital. Well, I shouldn't say small animal, also did a lot of cows, but we didn't do horses.
Right, right.
So it was a small animal vet with a bovine.
Yeah. And at some point in time, your son Willie comes along.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened.
Oh yes, you do.
Will comes along, and I somehow knew it was going to be a boy, but I wanted a girl because I wanted them to like the horses. I wanted to have a little girl to share the horses with. And so it worked out fine because he loves the horses. He loves showing the horses. From the time he was little, he was out in the barn, and I remember one time when we were having a foal, and he was sitting on my lap, and we were looking through the cracks in the barn and in between the boards, and he says to me, "Mommy, when's it going to get up?" And I said, "Oh, it'll take a little while." And I said, "Right now we're just seeing its feet, you know." And that it didn't even faze him that there was the water and the afterbirth. He just wanted it to get up, and he hadn't even seen the face yet. I mean, nothing had come out but the 2 feet. And I thought, isn't that funny? And I think he was like about 3. And "Mommy, when's it going to stand up?" I thought, we got a ways to go here, kid, you know. But that was his first exposure. He's probably like me. He doesn't remember his first exposure to horses.
Yeah. And since then he's been with the Morgans really ever since. And
Yeah,
still
he's
very
had a little
involved.
touch of saddlebreds and
Yeah.
a little bit of hackney and some carriage work because my husband has gotten into carriage horses. So he's worked different ones. He's shown some Friesians, but I think probably his basic knowledge would be, I would have to say, the Morgans.
Okay. Now, at some point in time, your horse business builds up enough so that this becomes Dale's full-time endeavor.
Yes.
Correct?
Yeah.
And was his first connection was really Judge Cribb?
Yes. And that was a carriage person who had a horse run away with him. And of course, they never tell you that when they ask if you will work with a horse because they want to get it to drive. Meanwhile, we found out it ran down the streets of Canandaigua with a carriage hooked to it and no driver. So of course, Dale says, "Well, yeah, I'll try training that horse for you, you know." And like I said, we didn't know any of the other parts. And he took the horse in and got it going and got it driving and had the judge came over. And the judge he wanted to drive the horse, but more than anything, he wanted to go to Walnut Hill. And this was a Morgan, and old breeding, tinderbox breeding, actually came through a sale and through Longview Farms, which was Cacamis's. And he got the mare going, and she had a lot of go. Wasn't a pretty horse, but a lot of motion, a lot of forward go, and could go all day long. You couldn't tire her out. Couldn't walk. We didn't have a walk. Anybody who's been to Walnut Hill knows that carriage horses have to walk. So they spent 2 years learning that they couldn't compete on that level if they didn't have a horse that could walk. And then the judge said, "Well, let's get some new horses." And that's kind of where it all started. And Dale had horses for him. We bred a few horses for him. And then once that horse was in the barn, then the next thing we know, probably one of our second clients was a friend, Terry Zimmer, who brought her young Morgan over to get started. And we never did a lot of advertising. It was mostly word of mouth, and the horses seemed to come in, and not always Morgans, but almost always starting with 2-year-olds that needed harness breaking.
Now, I want to back up a minute because probably we've been friends for going on 30 years now, and one of my strongest memories is of Dale with Greenmead's Emily and that red road cart.
That was the judge's. His father bought it for him when he was 14 years old. And he used to apparently date in that cart, which Dale and I can't quite figure out because the seat is enough for about 1.5 people. But he actually will tell stories of driving from Canandaigua to neighboring towns to pick up a girl and drive home. And apparently that was quite a sporty vehicle at the time.
So it was like picking somebody up in a Porsche.
Well, yeah, maybe. Red, too.
Yeah.
And so once Dale started carriage driving, he had that redone, and he wanted that carriage used. And not to say that he didn't have, 60 or 70 to pick from, but that was one of his favorite carriages,
Yeah.
is one that he had that his father had bought him.
And Emily wasn't a big horse. She was a registered Morgan. She was maybe, what, 14-1, 14-2?
She was always right on the borderline, but always showed in large pony division. But she could trot, and that came from the Saddleback Supreme background. Trot and never get tired. And Dale won an awful lot of championships with that mare, and you know, she was just always there for him, always had more to go, and never got tired. She was a real good mare, and she's still alive. She's still there and kicking and doing real well. Went up to Greenmead's farm to get her, and actually bought her as part of a pair. There was a 3-year-old that came with her. And unfortunately, the 3-year-old broke a leg in pasture, and we never put them together as a pair. But Emily certainly earned her keep in all the years that the judge had her.
I remember for many years at Walnut Hill, when they would have the kind of the Saturday entertainment classes, they would put in the Cones classes, and people would go through the classes as individuals.
Right, well, that was an invitational class.
All right.
You had to be invited to be in that. So what they usually did was they would limit it to 8 or 10 or 12 horses, and it was the top winners from the year before.
And you'd see all the horses go, and they'd always save Dale for last.
They'll claim they didn't do that, but it was kind of random that every year we were the last to go. And just, you know, I would say probably 95% of the time he'd end up with the best time in there. But what he liked about Emily was, because she was small, she was handy. And he could turn her and not lose a lick of time, and he'd never take her out of a trot. You know, she could trot as fast as a lot of horses can canter. And people often said, you know, what kind of a horse is that? Is that a Morgan? You know, where did you get that horse? And I think she sold a lot of people that do carriage driving on Morgans, because it used to be there would be 2 or 3 Morgans at these shows, at these carriage shows. Now there's probably 50 to 60% Morgans, especially in the single horse large pony division.
Now you have about 2 or 3 foals a year, pretty steadily?
We try to have 2 to 3 foals a year. Every once in a while we'll have 4, and then we say that's too much, and every once in a while we'll only have 1. But the trouble with one foal, in my feeling, is they don't learn a lot of horse behavior without having someone their own age to learn what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what play behavior is and what nasty behavior is. And horses, like any other animal, teach each other a lot that we as humans can't teach them. So I really like having more than 1 foal when I have one.
And then let's talk a little bit about your foundation stallion and how you came about him.
Well, I was very lucky to have Luciano. I happened to be in the right place at the right time. I was breeding a mare at Covent Gardens to a horse called Banner's Warlord. And I went down there, and I had seen Luciano, but he was only, I believe he was 3. I had first seen him at Claire Murphy's as a yearling just before they sold him. And then, of course, he was at Covent Garden for the big gala that they had when they retired in command. So I had seen him both those places and stuff, but he was a young horse. So I was down there breeding to that horse, and at that time, Luciano was the summer of his 3-year-old year, I believe.
And he's also, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't he the last son of In Command, or the next to last?
He is in the last full crop. There were
Right.
2 colts born that year.
Right.
And I can't tell you which one was born when, so I'm not sure if he was the very last one born or not. But he is obviously the last year they were born. And I went down to pick up my mare from being bred, and at that time the manager there said to me, you know, they're selling the farm. They're getting out from under here. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, they're selling everything. And she says, you've always liked that In Command son. And I said, well, I can't afford him. And she said to me, make an offer. And I said, well, I can't offer what this horse is worth. And she said, Nancy, make an offer and I will send it on. So I made a ridiculous offer, and we're loading the horse, and she comes, of course that's before cell phones or anything else, and it took her a while to get a hold of him and everything, and she said, how soon can you pick the horse up? I said, you got to be kidding. She said, if you can be back here within 48 hours with the money, then you can take the horse. So I said, I can do that. And I really didn't want to truck home this green horse, this green stallion with my mare that had just been bred. So I said, and I didn't have the money at that time, it was late in the afternoon, so I got home and figured out a way to come up with the money, and actually took in a partner. Cindy Pulver went in with halves with me because I couldn't come up with all the money in that short a notice. And we went back and we picked him up, and when we went to pick him up, who do I run into but Hal Hoover? And one thing about Hal, you never run into him without his camera. So I have some nice pictures that he sent me the day we picked the horse up. And he said to me, young lady, he says, I don't know how you did it, but you got the bargain of the farm. And that was before we ever bred the horse, before we ever did it. So I feel quite certain that he was coming up there probably to look at that horse, and that's why I had the 48-hour deadline. And I ended up with him. And I feel very fortunate that I did. He's certainly been a wonderful stallion for me, and wonderfully mannered stallion, wonderful horse to have on the farm, and we still have him in his retirement there. And I can't tell you how much money he's probably made me in sales over the years of selling his offspring.
That's right, because his offspring have gone on to be a number of world titles.
Correct.
And many
In different divisions.
Yeah.
You know, he's had Western, he's had English Pleasure, he's had park horses, he's had parade champions that Art Perry had. So he's had quite a wide variety of horses, and all very tractable, workable horses, horses that people can enjoy as much as they enjoy showing. They can enjoy them at home just as much.
Now you've evolved into a nice mid-sized public training stable, correct?
Correct. I like to call it a family operation, because I don't want to have more horses than what we can handle as a family. I mean, it's fine if people come in to do stalls and things like that, but all our horses, either it's Dale, me, or Will that work them for that day. There's not a lot of outside people that have their hands on them.
Do you have a specialty, or?
I don't know that I would categorize myself as a specialty. I think, you know, Dale kind of handles the harness horses. Will is great with the in-hand horses. I probably do most of the saddle training. But per division, I don't feel that I have any more expertise in one than the other. Although I think probably if you were interviewing somebody else and ask them, what do you think that Nancy specializes in, they would probably say Western. So, which is fine. I'm not opposed to that, but I like a good park horse as well as anybody.
Right, right. And I think it's always kind of that hidden secret about your driving ability too, going back to as a young age. You could drive a horse as well as anybody else.
Well, yeah, that's probably true, and I'm not afraid to drive a horse, but as long as somebody else can do a good job, and I feel Dale has got a real good knack for that, I'm happy not to get back in the carriage or in the cart. I know one time I did at Walnut Hill. In fact, I think it was your fault because you couldn't show up for a class. So I took your horse, Scotch on the Rocks, into the reinsmanship class. And I'll never forget it because one of the probably best known drivers in carriage driving is Katie Whaley, and she had a horse in there. And I didn't win the class, but I was second and Katie was third. So there was always that thing that, I guess I'm a pretty good driver here. And I, to this day, can't tell you who won the class. I don't remember. But I remember I beat Katie Whaley, and that was quite a feather in my cap. She probably doesn't remember it, but I do.
But you do. And now you've recently, when I say recently, probably the past 6 or 7 years, or maybe a little bit longer, have gotten very involved with youth and with riding lessons and equitation training, correct?
Yes, I think probably a lot of it started when RIT, which is Rochester Institute and Technology School, their kids came to me to start a riding program with them. And actually Joanne Squire's daughter was at the school at the time, and she recommended me. So I started working with their riding program, and of course since they don't have a stable or horses, I supplied that. The hard part was they had to drive from the college to my house. A lot of times transportation was an issue. So we went around with that, but we got it done and we went to competitions. We had a good time. We maybe weren't as competitive as some of the schools, such as Casanova, who has on-site everything, you know. But we had a lot of fun. The kids learned, and I think they really enjoyed it. They now have a site closer to the campus, and I'm no longer doing that, but it kind of got me really interested in helping the young riders out as much as I could. And I do have a youth group that I adore. We are working all the time on different projects, and they've always got some great ideas, and we work them together, and we do a fitting and showmanship clinic every year. And I said, now that I'm president, I think I'm going to have to let somebody else do this. And I'm still doing it. I don't know what it is. Nobody seemed to step up and say, oh, I'll take it over. And honestly, probably I didn't push all that hard to get rid of it. So I'm enjoying it. And the kids are very tolerant with my schedule. And we've changed to having regular meetings like the first Saturday of the month to whenever I can fit it in. And they like that. And they haven't given me a hard time about it. So.
Now, you just mentioned that now that you're president, you actually, this is your second term as president of the New York State Morgan Horse Society. Your first term was, I think, in the early 2000. And when did you first get involved with the club? It was, I want to say, in the early 70s, but how did you make that connection?
No, it was in the late 70s, and actually the first time I really got involved with the workings of the club, Claire Murphy gave me the first membership form to fill out when I bought my first horse. But I got actively interested when they started to talk about having a Western District show in Western District, which could be easily commutable for me, and it would be a smaller show so I wouldn't feel like I was out of my element. And I mean, I always felt like the New York show was just too big, too much, you know, too many trainers, just way over my head. And I was new to the breed, so I wanted to get my feet wet, but I didn't want to go there. So we started talking about this Western District show, and I talked to a few people. And Mark Langdon, I had met through Suzanne. He kind of pulled me on board and said, why don't you help us work on this? I've got this planned out and this planned out, and we're going to go to the board and see if they'll give us some money for it. So that was really my first workings with the board. And of course, they turned us flatly down and said, no, you can't have it. You don't know how to do it, and you don't have enough money coming in to pay for this. And so we came back to the board, and finally they gave us a shot at it, which was worked out well, I guess. What is it now? And it's 27th year or something.
Yeah.
So I guess we did okay. But that was when I started working with the club as a unit of board members, of what you needed to do to get where you are. So I've known the workings of the club for a long time, and it's a real good opportunity, I think, for anybody to get active with people from all different walks of life, but have the common feeling of how much we love our Morgans, whether we trail ride them, whether we show them, whether we're on the board, whether we're just a person who wants to know who our nearest neighbor is that has a Morgan that I could talk to. And that's been probably the thing I think that is the best part of the club, is that I've met lifelong friends, such as the person interviewing me.
Well, I remember that it was over 30 years ago that I purchased my first Morgan from, well, actually it was from Polly Ford, Andy Ford's mother.
Right.
And that led to my second Morgan, which I purchased from Dottie and Wally Holmes. And then I made the connection to the club, and somehow I got your phone number, and you said there are a bunch of us meeting for drinks. And I'll be the tall redhead. And I said, no, I'll be the tall redhead.
And I can remember that very plainly because you said, well, I'll be taller than you. And I said, I doubt it. And we were already seated, and Valerie walked into the room, and it was a bar room that was also a restaurant. And I looked up and I said, that's Valerie. And they said, how do you know? I said, watch this. And I walked over and I stood next to her, and she had a good inch on me. I said, that's Valerie. And we both immediately, when we looked at each other, knew that we were the two people that were set up to meet.
But I think you're absolutely right that the fact that the club was and still is kind of a welcoming environment for people that are just coming into the breed, as well as people that have been longtime New York members. We come together for our special events throughout the year, and it's like, seeing old friends.
Right, and some of them don't have anything to do with horses. It's just a nice get-together to say, let's have a drink, let's have a breakfast, let's just talk about our Morgans. We don't have to have them here with us. We can still enjoy our lives with our Morgans and share it with our friends. A lot of people, I knew everything about their Morgans and where they show and who their trainer is. Don't know what they did for a living, how many kids they had, what kind of car they drove. Didn't know any of the stuff that you usually at parties talk about, because people say, oh, where do you work? Oh, what's your position? Da, da, da. We say, do you have a Morgan? And then from there, it's all about the horse. And, it was always that way. And I thought it was really funny. Somebody will say, she's the vice president of IBM. I said, I never knew that. And then, you find out later that there's somebody that really is important and all you know about them is that they have a real cute little bay mare that you just love.
That's
So it's always been kind of about the people and the horses more than anything else to me.
Right. Isn't that wonderful? Now,